Sir, can you give me your name and your job title, please?
Matt Roller, assistant editor, ESPN Cricinfo.
Beautiful. We are going to go through the entirety of all 16 World Cup teams. And so I'm going to be testing your knowledge with the first few teams. But I put them in a basic order, Roller. But I would say that it's not like I put them from 16 to 1, obviously, but there's a few tiers, I think. And I don't think there's that much between the sixth best team and the first best team, for instance. But I think there's probably a fair bit of difference between the sixth best and the seventh and the eighth, if that makes sense. And then that's how I'm explaining it in my head, anyway. Also, for when people go, "Well, you've got that team at number whatever," it's more casual than that. I can start with UAE. I thought they were the weakest team at the World Cup, but one thing I would say is that they're probably the best weakest team at a major World Cup when we've had this many teams we've ever had. I thought they bowled really well. In fact, I was doing some stats the other day and I had to take their numbers out because their numbers were too good and it was screwing up all my metrics of just how good their bowling was over the 3 games. They obviously had to completely change everything about their cricket after a third of their squad disappeared due to match fixing related scandals and other scandals. What did you think of them? I thought they were okay, but they had 2 batters that looked good on paper, but when they came out, didn't make many runs. But their bowlers really stood up.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right to say they're the best worst team that a tournament has probably ever had, a tournament this big at least. And I would say, bearing in mind they probably made a bit of an error at selection because I think Rohan Mustafa, who's been their sort of talisman all-rounder for however many years, didn't get picked and I think is now back in the team. So it looks like one of those sort of weird selection politics things that happens occasionally in associate cricket. You consider that, the fact that they managed to win that game against Namibia with a makeshift death bowler in Mohammed Wasim, and also just sort of looking for UAE moving forward, they probably won't win that many hearts along the way because people have certain opinions about UAE and probably rightly so at times. But I think if you consider the fact that at least 12 minimum players are going to be involved in the ILT20 next year. People are playing in Abu Dhabi T10. There's now a pathway that there probably hasn't been before for players in UAE cricket to develop. So I think they despite the fact they didn't make a huge lasting impact on the World Cup for themselves, they obviously did for other teams in terms of having, if they hadn't beaten Namibia, the Netherlands wouldn't have been through, and you have all sorts of different spiraling effects of that. But I think even though they didn't make a lasting impression at this World Cup, I think that they're actually quite well placed for the future.
Yeah, also they've got Mayapan, the leg spinner, who looks like a genuine leg spinning prospect. And if you compare him to, I don't know, maybe Hayden Walsh Jr., he's somewhere between Hayden Walsh Jr. and where Sandeep Lamachane was, like on the random player, a leg spinner suddenly getting a lot of hype scale. So I think from that perspective, there's something there. Aravind, I thought, was a little bit disappointing at times. And the other the opener, the big old fella, who I thought might be slightly better, looked a little bit like he struggled at that level. But if you look at his record, he's made runs against Ireland before, and a lot of them had just never actually been out of the UAE to play, well, certainly never been to Australia to play cricket, and they did look like that at times. If you go on to Namibia, they do slightly better than they look like they should on paper, and that the bowling unit works very well together, and the fielders back them up, but they still struggle to make the sort of runs that are going to consistently get them to beat teams like Sri Lanka. It's not that they can't beat them, because the kind of low mistake cricket they play, like if other teams are taking risks, there's always a chance of being in the game. But it's hard to see them ever winning consistently. And I'm not sure much has changed since last time, other than the fact that, they had a black African player in their side this time who actually they gave the ball to rather than last time when that didn't happen.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I suppose the positive thing from their point of view would be that they won without Visa contributing at the start, because it felt like, and without Trumpelman playing as well, because Trumpelman only played one of the 3 games, I think. So, and it felt like in the last World Cup that they didn't really have enough depth, especially because I think Erasmus was playing through injury last time, and Smith didn't really make much of a contribution. So I think last time it felt like if they were going to win a game, it was always going to be because of one of those two doing something pretty special. Whereas this time to have competed at least pretty well throughout the initial phase without those two turning in huge performances was pretty massive. Obviously, Visa did get that. It did take them really, really close in that crucial game against UAE, and their tournament could have been very, very different if that catch hadn't been held on the boundary. But I would agree. I don't think a lot has changed. I think they'll be, I guess, relatively confident of. It's all about development and infrastructure, isn't it, for Namibia, and getting that in place, heading forwards rather than focusing too much. They're realistically not going to reach the last 8 of the 2024 World Cup with the format changing, which is quite an interesting thing. I guess we'll probably come onto this on a few teams. It's like people have finally adjusted expectations as to what counts as a good World Cup based on this format, but then the format is now changing for the next one, so you suddenly have to readjust and think actually it might be quite a good achievement for someone to get to the top 8. Whereas previously, even competing in the Super 12s and looking like you might get to the semis has been pretty impressive for certain teams at this point.
Well, in Namibia as well, I haven't looked into this much. I'm not sure if you has, but the fact that they haven't automatically qualified for the 2027 tournament which is a really interesting one, because it feels like, and I'd have to talk to the ICC and go through the details, but it does feel like, reading between the lines a little bit, like we're not sure how good this team's going to be in that period of time. And it's not the USA, so they're not throwing money at it hoping that it works in the same way. So on to the Netherlands. A fascinating team, because we've now seen a lot of them over these last 2 World Cups, and they've basically had Max O'Dowd bats and I don't know, 2 Colin Ackerman innings. Is like almost their entire World Cup batting has been that, and yet they're bowling. And I know it was a bowling World Cup, but even within that, Paul van Meekeren's figures are phenomenal. Like, he was just absolutely brilliant, and I don't think his figures did as much justice. Even like, I had a look at their Cricinfo advanced metrics, and I was like, I think these have even underestimated how good he was. There were times when they were playing him, they were literally going, well, we're not going to try and score off him here, we'll just knock him around the corner. He was at that level. He seems to have taken a huge leap. My worry is that they tried 2 young batters, and by the end of the tournament, one wasn't in the team, and the other one was batting at number 5 or 6 with a facial injury. And those old batters who didn't make any runs in the last World Cup and didn't make any runs at this World Cup are going to be even older by the next time they get around. And you and I probably saw a lot of them play in the last Netherlands summer. There's not a lot of strong batting, that's pushing. Like, Vikramjit didn't make any runs, and he was probably him and Baz Delita were the 2 most impressive guys. You could see why they took the chance. And you've got, Myberg retiring. So they're losing some of the safety net of some of those older guys who've been around as well. And surely Max O'Dowd can't actually score all the runs for them in the next World Cup.
So just to clarify, you got them 14th on these.
Yes. Where would you have them?
I would have them a little bit higher, just because I think that, much as I completely agree that their batting didn't click at all, I think, they lost to Bangladesh by 9 runs, and if they'd won that game, they would have had 3 wins and really been in contention for the semi-finals. So I think I would have them a little higher than this. I think just in terms of, while I completely agree the batting was poor, I think the bowling attack was really, really good for the most part. For example, even that game at the SCG where they were bowling to India, I think the fact that they only managed to take 2 wickets and still restricted them to 180 on what was pretty decent pitch, well, that probably showed how skilled some of their bowlers were at the death. I mean, no one really went at more than about 8 and over, I think, across the tournament. Van Meekeren was the obvious standout for me, but then, Klassen was very good. Glover came into it towards the end of the tournament. And Tim Pringle was very good as a sort of defensive holding spinner as well across the tournament. So I think, personally, I thought they did all right. I think conditions in Australia probably didn't suit them. I think, there's not a lot of cricket pitches in the Netherlands, but a lot of the ones that there are there, and I remember this was a talking point during the England series, a lot of them aren't great, and they probably, could at some points in the home summer have used that to their advantage a bit more, because I remember, when they put England in on a road and they got 498, there were a few people in Dutch cricket saying, why are we being such good hosts? Why don't we make them play on a sticky dog in Utrecht? But based on that, you think maybe conditions might suit their batters a little bit more in the Caribbean, where traditionally, you at least have some pitches with low bounce and smaller boundaries, and it's more of a sort of sixes game than it was here. So I think there are good signs for Netherlands, even though clearly the batting didn't click. I thought Scott Edwards maybe, I don't know, maybe used in the wrong role. I thought he's such a good player of spin, and he was kind of wasted at 5 and 6, and didn't quite get the opportunity to show how good he was, I thought. But yeah, I think, and especially, I think the bigger picture stuff with Netherlands is great as well. The fact that they've qualified for 2024 is massive for them, because they don't have the jeopardy of qualifying tournaments. And even though they so often have to play half-strength teams because of county cricket clashing, and that's insane in its own way, I think that there is now that core of Netherlands-based players who will hopefully at least stay together for a number of years.
Yeah, I think my low rating is that I think Ackerman is the only player in the next World Cup of that middle order. And you're right. They might. I mean, Edwards had a bad World Cup, but we saw how good he could be in the Netherlands summer. So I'm not too worried about him. But it's if Vikranjit doesn't come off and Baz de Leede can't bat in the top 4, and at this stage we don't know. They're going to be walking into the next World Cup again with a very good bowling lineup that's a little bit older. That's why I have them a little bit lower. But to be honest, Scotland is the next team, and Scotland's a bit of a shit show because if you look at Scotland's World Cup, so Scottish cricket almost combusted when they didn't make the next round. I don't know how much you followed about this on Twitter. It became a racial issue, became a political issue. Obviously, there's all the things going on with the Race Commission. We did a whole episode on it on Reading for a couple of weeks back. And when you look at it, you're just like, well, if Camphor, one of those shots actually gets caught when he was swinging off his tits early on, right? They just go through to the next round. But it doesn't feel to me like right at the moment, I still think Scotland have more talent on both sides of the ball than the Netherlands do, right? And that's the big difference for me when you look at that overall lineup. Having said that, I think Netherlands, obviously, as you said, they didn't go that far away from beating Bangladesh in that other game as well, and pushing for a semi-final position. But you do look at Scotland, and they were almost in the next round until Camphor went completely nuts. I worry about Scotland's top 4. Obviously it's not even complete anymore. But George Munsey is just not scoring at the rate that he used to. Callum McLeod looks like he's getting stuck a little bit in T20 cricket. Richie Barrington didn't fire as much at this World Cup, but has been really good for them. The bowling was almost more of a concern because I feel that their bowling has been quite solid, and suddenly it was the first time I was like, I'm not sure this is going to come off. It may be the first World Cup where Josh Davey hasn't taken a bunch of wickets out of his ass, right?
Yeah.
Josh Davey just turns up at World Cups and takes more wickets than he ever has for Somerset, and he's got a pretty good record for Somerset. But I just felt that it didn't click. But I think when I was looking at them in the Netherlands as an overall structure, I just felt there were more cricketers at the very least. Like, someone like Matthew Cross. Like, I think, the Dutch would love to have him opening the batting with Max O'Dowd, right? Like, they don't have Matthew Cross style players. And you look at Michael Jones's innings, and they still haven't quite unleashed the 2-pronged left arm finger spin machine of Hamza Tahir and Mark Watt all together. But if you were to say to me that Netherlands should be in front of them, I'm not sure I have a great argument other than the fact that I don't trust Netherlands batting going into the next tournament. Whereas I think Scotland still has a pretty solid team. They just had a bit of a nightmare exit when realistically Ireland could have been the team that was the embarrassment and exploded.
Yeah, it was a slightly strange comp for Scotland because, as you say, Munsey, despite being their top scorer, didn't actually really get going at any point and kept on, getting these halftime interviews and all these match awards and stuff like that and saying, no, I really didn't play very well, guys. Just because I got 50 doesn't mean it was good. And yet, despite the fact none of their batters really seemed to ever get going, they still managed 160 and 170 something against Ireland. So they still did post 2 decent totals, despite the fact that none of their batters looked like they were in brilliant form. I do take the point.
That's one thing when you look at those other teams. Sorry, just to interrupt you, but if you look at those other teams that we're talking about, and you can go all the way through to probably Afghanistan, Zimbabwe, Bangladesh, who will obviously be coming up later on, I wonder if consistently Scotland can actually make more runs than some of those teams.
Yeah,
right?
I take the point.
And also, beforehand, I thought their bowlers, and so that is one reason I had them ahead of Netherlands. It's just that ability to keep themselves in the game with runs that some of the other really good teams out, or some of the teams on that similar level, are just so bowler dependent.
And also, they only played two T20 games between the two World Cups, which is completely insane. But I remember, that was a huge reason why Netherlands were no good in the UAE, was because they hadn't played any T20 cricket. And the fact that Scotland managed to get within, one fairly freakish innings from camphor away from getting to the next round, despite the fact they played so little cricket, I suppose does suggest that if they get a decent fixture list over the next couple of years, which there's no guarantee they will, then yeah, who knows? Maybe they will compete a bit better in the Caribbean.
So next one, it'd be interesting to see how you feel on this one. But I've got Zimbabwe as next.
Okay, yeah.
And I don't know where to put Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, and Ireland, right? Because Zimbabwe really, really impressed at times, but their batting is held up by a 36-year-old number 5, right? And their best batter is, what's his name? Dion Myers, who's playing college cricket in England at the moment, right? He's not even part of the Zimbabwean setup, right? He's like the next great batting talent in Zimbabwe, and he's, I don't know, doing an accountancy degree. He may not be doing an accountancy degree, Roller. I'm just trying to think of something he may be studying. But, and so that bowling attack is really legit. But if you look at Afghanistan, it's not like their bowling attack is bad either. So I've got Zimbabwe next. I would love to see how those 4 main seamers, I suppose, if you include Wheel now, who I didn't know much about coming in. They still you've got the old fella bowling his knuckleballs now. Ryan Bell was barely used in this tournament, and I think you and I have seen enough of him to know he's sort of a low-level, franchise-level leg spinner who can hold a bat as well. And they didn't even have to use, you remember in the old days in Zimbabwe, the Irvines and the Williams would be bowling their finger spin. They didn't even need that. When they go to Asia and specifically, as you said, in the Caribbean, they're probably going to be bowling a bit of that sort of stuff, right? Like they're going to be bowling a little bit of that part-timey spin stuff at times. But I don't know. They don't seem to have any batting that, it really, for me, it was Raza or bust in this tournament.
Yeah, I take the point. I think to be honest, the big thing for me was just the enjoyment of seeing Zimbabwe actually at a tournament again and doing pretty well, because I having sort of missed out on, I guess, the glory era of Zimbabwe because I was a little bit too young for it, or Zimbabwean cricket, I should say. Very much not the glory era of Zimbabwe, but having sort of come into the game and started following the game when I did, I think it feels like that's sort of been a glaring hole, the sort of second big African team. And then to suddenly have, 3 in this tournament, and Zimbabwe competing pretty well. I loved watching their games, especially the first round in Hobart. It was so well followed when it looked absolutely grim and miserable when it was about 10 degrees. And people were still singing and dancing in the stands, which was great. And yeah, I think they felt more like a moments team almost than a sort of a structured unit or anything like that. It felt like a team where I don't know. It felt like there were more sort of moments of volatility in any of their games where they could be going absolutely nowhere with the bat, and then Raza would come in and smoke 20 runs off his first 8 balls, and completely change the game. And kind of the same with the seamers, where Ngaravu and Blessing, both of them. They both look like high quality players who, if they're nurtured right, and I know the infrastructure is still not really there in Zimbabwean cricket, but if they do get opportunities to play, and Blessing definitely is on the franchise circuit, and I think Ngaravu hopefully won't be too far behind. If they do get opportunities, and I think they'll develop into really, really good fast bowlers in time. So yeah, I think there were definitely bits of promise, but I can see why as well, having sort of tailed off as they did, why you would rank them behind Afghanistan and Ireland, even though Afghanistan left winless. But I guess they're a kind of a different case almost.
Yeah, I don't know what to do with Afghanistan. One thing I would say with Zimbabwe is I think their fans win best fans of the tournament. And by I think, I mean, you and I now, this is official. I'll send it through to the ICC. We'll get an article up on Cricinfo, quick 300 words. More news to follow. But I'm pretty sure Zimbabwe fans won fans of the tournament. So Afghanistan, I feel like they didn't play in this tournament. Right? I feel like, because was it 2 of their first 3 that were washed out? Am I remembering the numbers right? Or was it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I definitely had the same feeling right at the end, where Nabi was being interviewed and was obviously about to quit the captaincy as well, which no one knew about at the time. But he was being interviewed at the end and was sort of saying, "Well, I don't know really. We've we had a game against England in Perth, which is probably the least suited venue to Afghanistan's team out of any. Then I think they had 10 days before their next game because of the fact they had, I think, 2 washouts in a row. I think you're right. And then by that point they were basically out. So what do you really want them to do? And I think they basically performed around what you'd expect, in that they, in games against decent sides, gave them a bit of a run, especially against Australia in the last game, but without quite having enough runs to actually get over the line. And it's tricky for Afghanistan, isn't it? With the sort of, they have the Case Ahmed as the sort of Stuart McGill of his era, in that he's not going to play. He didn't play any games in this World Cup. He doesn't play many games of international cricket, despite the fact he's pretty high up. If you were doing a ranking of the best leg spinners in the world, he'd probably feature quite prominently. But he's just not going to play, and I wonder if that will even change in the next World Cup in the Caribbean. There's probably a case for it by that point. But yeah, I don't know. We'll see. I thought it was slightly weird they left Naveen out at the start. I think if they'd picked Naveen, they would have been a slightly better attack at the start. But I don't know. As you say, it felt like such a weird tournament for them where nothing really happened, and then you have to sort of pick the bones out of 3 games that didn't suit them in conditions. The conditions didn't suit them. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think looking at their batting, there's an element of like, I think they have the ability to score 140 to 160 more than some of these other teams, and I think that's why I've got them slightly higher up. But you do look at their batting, and it's like, I think their sloggers struggle against the best bowling attacks, and they'll you might get one guy come off, but maybe for 25 to 35 runs, and then their proper batters just are so slow. But it's an incredible bowling attack, but I don't want to mark them down too low for this particular tournament, because I do think they're slightly better than what we saw. And it was ridiculous. I mean, a month into the tournament, it felt like they hadn't even played a game. So I've got Ireland next. I've got notes on Ireland. They can't play spin or bowl spin, which is a bit of an issue. Poor George Dockrell had to come back as frontline spinner after all these years again. But against pace and bowl, and obviously they've got, interesting pace bowling attack especially with the Dare and Little. They probably missed out on, was it Craig Young that wasn't available? So Barry McCarthy probably should have been the 4th seamer, and he ends up being the 3rd seamer, which is obviously a bit of a problem there. But for me, if you would have asked me 3 months ago, I would have said the biggest problem is that Lorcan Tucker's probably a number 6 or number 7. And now I would say that Lorcan Tucker is the answer to every question that you could ever ask about Ireland cricket. He can go anywhere. He'd probably be their best spinner in a couple of months as well. Take the gloves off and start bowling leg spinners. Yeah,
given Ireland's sort of historic reliance on Sterling as well, the fact that I think he got 150 in the tournament but averaged 20 something and struck at 130, he was fine, but he didn't blow anyone away. Given that, I think they did really well to finish as well as they did. And I think, again, they probably got screwed a little bit by the schedule, because they won that game to qualify against West Indies, and then I think something like 2 days later, they were playing in a different part of Australia. They got on a flight and then had a game against Sri Lanka, which happened in the middle of the night. So no one in Ireland at least sort of paid any attention to it, because, it was almost like job done. But then if you look back, if they'd had a bit more time to prepare, maybe they would have given Sri Lanka a better game. And then, who knows if they then manage to beat England, whether they can at least be in some sort of contention for the semis. I think, that's probably a step too far to suggest that. But I thought it was a pretty solid tournament from Ireland's point of view. And I think, having lost a lot of games, but not by big margins throughout the home summer, that's sort of one of those things that sets you up quite weirdly, where you don't have any experience of winning. But I think the team seemed, at least from speaking to a couple of players in the build-up, to have some confidence of, we actually know how we want to play T20 cricket now. We want to be quite aggressive. The bowlers kind of had some roles at least, and they were just a lot clearer than they were sort of towards the back end of, they obviously flopped in the UAE last year. They did still, the one frustrating thing was with Ireland was they still seemed to have that sort of gap, and I guess that would be where Craig Young would have played, but there was a one spot that ended up being split pretty much 50-50 between Simi Singh and Fionn Hand. And that spot, they both kind of felt like misfits in the team, and that basically felt like the big issue for me with Ireland this tournament was. And I suppose also you had someone like Tector playing, who, while I think he could be a good T20 player, he's a sort of player where, you know, if he was in a 6th or 7th ranked country rather than 10th ranked country in the world, he would probably be focusing on Test cricket and 50 over cricket, and they would have a young slogger in the T20 team for now while he's still developed his game. Whereas instead he's played quite a lot of T20 internationals now and has a pretty average record, just because it's not a format that's hugely suited to him, but there's not a lot of other guys who can do it. So I think they're an interesting team. I think there's still enough of a gap. It's also really frustrating for them that they're going to have to qualify for the next tournament. And there was a point as well where they were really screwed, because if Netherlands hadn't beaten South Africa, it would have been them, Scotland and Netherlands, competing for 2 spots in the 2024 World Cup and a Europe qualifier, which would have been unbelievably cutthroat.
It would have been a great tournament to cover. So it's a shame from that perspective, but obviously much better for them. That game in Sri Lanka, I think it was still played in Blundstone, so I think it was still Belrive. But that was the game when Tikshana bowled his overs for 19 runs in Blundstone, which had not been particularly, I mean, the seamers have been dominating. And I think Hasaranga, so I'm just trying to bring up the stat. And Hasaranga took 2 for 25, and then DDS came on and took 1 for 13 as well. So it's just a classic case of them completely falling apart against spin. And they were dog shit in that game, right? Like it's worth remembering. Like if you look at the first, 30 overs of the game against Scotland, and then that game against Sri Lanka, like, at that point in the tournament, you're like, this is terrible. What is this team doing? And then they beat England on the back of that. And so things changed very, very quickly. All right, I've got West Indies next, mate. I put them there based on the fact that we have to assume they're never going to be full strength ever again. And also, even if they are full strength, I'm not sure that they have enough players who could average 30 in any format of cricket, really, but certainly T20 cricket. And they really need guys like, Shepherd and Odean Smith and Akil Hassan to be all more consistent with the bat, if that's ever going to be the case. I thought they took some strides in their bowling, weirdly enough, in this tournament from what we saw in the UAE. But then again, maybe it was just because it was good bowling conditions and and that was the case. But they were pretty ordinary.
I genuinely thought I was going to ask you in a second whether we'd forgotten to do them and needed to edit it so we could go back in and put them way lower down, because I thought they were really poor. I think particularly with the bat, just having watched and loved those teams in 2012, 2014 was probably actually the best year of those 3 tournaments for West Indies in terms of how pure that team was. That was a great team that really, it arguably deserved a title in a way, even more than the other 2 did. But having watched those, the 2012, 2014 and 2016, and just loved the way they played. And I suppose the conditions did suit them in those tournaments to a certain extent in a way that Australia was never going to. But I was just so disappointed with how West Indies went. I think batting wise, I just, people talk about them as being a 6 or out team, but they don't really hit any 6s anymore, especially in Australia when obviously Blundstone is different, but still some pretty long boundaries there, and they don't hit a lot of 6s. I think no one in the squad struck it over 130 in the tournament. So it always looked like it kind of always looked like a disaster waiting to happen. A West Indies World Cup where they've just lost this generation of players and tried to replace them in a 12-month window and in conditions that are the worst for West Indies in terms of the extra bounce that you got in Australia. And yeah, I agree. The bowling attack at times, I think Joseph looked really good. It seems really strange that he's played as few T20 internationals as he has, but he's a really promising player. Obed McCoy's pretty good bowler. Holder bowled well in the tournament. Hossain was kind of fine as a holding spinner as well. So they do have some players there, but the batting was just terrible. Puran couldn't get any runs and always looked like he was going to struggle against pace and bounce, and struggled against pace and bounce. What I would say is that heading into a World Cup in home conditions in 2024, there's every chance they'll compete to get to the last 8, because I think that should play into their hands. They'll have home advantage. The players are familiar with grounds in a way that few others will be. But it just looks like a real mess at the moment. We've both thought a lot about West Indies T20 cricket over the last however long. You know, I did a long piece earlier in the year. I know you've covered them quite extensively as well, and the systems and structures and player development and talent ID, none of it just seems to be there at the moment. I thought the worst thing for them in this World Cup was to go in without, and you know, you talk about the fact we have to accept they might never be at full strength again, but the actual reasons given for people's absence, like Russell, people just, you know, Desmond Haynes goes on TV during a CPL game and says, oh yeah, we kind of moved on from him. It's like, this guy should still be one of the best T20 players in the world. I don't know if he is anymore, but he was for a period not very long ago, the best hitter in the world.
Let's be honest, he could have won them one game in that qualifier on his own.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. If Andre Russell in 3 games against those kinds of bowling attacks, right, could have won them 1 game on his own. Sunil Narine, right, again, could have won them 1 game. The reason I've got them higher is just because I do think there's still more talent there than most of the other teams we've talked about, and I think almost every team we've talked about so far would actually bite your dick off to get Nicholas Pooran into their batting lineup, right? So from that perspective, I still think they should be higher. But if you're talking about just this tournament, I think they definitely would have to be lower. But I am looking the fact that they're going back home for the next World Cup, and I'm you know, putting some money on it. It can't be this bad again, right? Where you know something has to go right in that time. I've got them and Bangladesh. I've got all West Indies, Bangladesh, all the way down to Namibia, all in the 1 tier, by the way. I just don't think right at the moment there's that much difference between all these teams, because the West Indies and Bangladesh have so many problems within their structure that they're going to have to overcome. And the other teams have it as well, but the other teams are like making do with what they can, and these 2 teams aren't. So Bangladesh is next. I think, right as we look at it now, I think this is a T20 bowling unit that can travel, right? And I'm maybe putting more hope on Lytton Das's sudden rise to superstar than I should be. But I'm still not sure they're going to make over 145, 150 to put enough pressure on the better teams, which is why I've still got them in that tier slightly below with all the others. But I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, this kind of, despite the fact that Shakib actually really struggled in this tournament, I think he scored 40-something runs and went at 8. So for a player like him, that was a pretty poor comp. But I think despite that, this kind of felt like the ceiling as to how well Bangladesh could have done in Australia, given, you know, I remember we did an equivalent one of these exactly 12 months ago, and during that time we're saying how Bangladesh's pitches and playing on slow and low surfaces in bilateral cricket and domestic cricket doesn't lend itself to playing well in World Cups in Australia. You know, that pretty much played out. I think they probably did as well as they could have hoped. They were in even semi-final contention heading into their last game, which is probably, you know, they'd have taken that for sure, I think, heading into a game against Pakistan. I think the bowling attack, I think, it's quite a strange one in that that Shakib, despite the fact he didn't bowl very well in this tournament, is clearly a pretty good finger spinner. And then Taskin, Ahmed and the Fizz are both probably IPL squad level seamers, and were both pretty good in this tournament too. I think Taskin in particular is going to be a really fun guy to watch how he develops over the next 5, 10 even years. But then there are those weak links, and I think I agree. The batting there's just probably not quite enough in there, and I think what they are is probably a team that will be interesting to watch in 50 over cricket in the World Cup in India next year, because their results in ODIs have been pretty good, and I think they have a lot of players who seem much more suited to scoring at a strike rate of 80 to 100 than scoring at a strike rate of 130 plus. And yeah, I think they'll be sort of dark horses to make the semi-finals of that tournament, but maybe not so much as a T20 side.
Yeah, I could see that. I almost feel that because they are more spoiling bowlers, you know, obviously Tuscan is slightly different, but you know, the rest of that bowling attack is more spoiling bowlers. If they can get to 240, 250 in a lot of games, they can maybe, you know, build some more artificial pressure in the one-day game. It'd be interesting to have a look. That's the end of that massive tier, of which there's just question marks on every single team. Next tier I have is completely just Sri Lanka on its own, because I think there was a little bit of undue hype about Sri Lanka, that when you actually pass out their record from the group stages through to the, the Super 12 round, they're 4-6, which is not horrendous, but they're basically beating the teams that you would expect them to beat, other than Namibia, and they're losing to the teams who you would expect them to lose to. And it feels like, to me, there's no obvious thing where they can jump up. I think in this tournament, they probably overperformed, considering their fast bowlers. Random people, Fidel Fernando was going to get called up at one stage, like, to bowl seam for them, right? Like, it was getting that bad. But I don't see. I think they're a slightly better batting unit than Bangladesh, and I think they have more talent overall than Bangladesh. But I don't see them as like a team that's about to join the top 6 teams and be a legitimate chance of winning the next tournament, unless 2 or 3 players make an incredible jump. It is like that number 6 and 7 position. That feels like, who's available, and they just chuck them a cap, and one of them's a captain.
Yeah, I think you're right that they probably performed pretty well, bearing in mind they didn't have any fit quicks. And in some of the games they lost, they actually played all right. Like against England, they could easily have won that game. At the SCG, they probably needed, not very many more runs to have created a little tiny bit more pressure in that chase. And they would have been, they would have been knocked out by net run rate. So it's a tricky one. I think. I basically think Sri Lanka are. I always went into this tournament thinking, and this was even after they won the Asia Cup, I thought they are particularly badly suited to playing in Australia. And I think how they do in the Caribbean will be almost entirely determined by which venues they get drawn at, because I think, Caribbean venues, depending on which group you get put in or which fixtures you get, you can have a quite markedly different tournament. So if
are you saying St. Lucia is a different pitch to Guyana?
Yeah, exactly. So if they're playing all these games at Providence, so they might be a pretty good side, but I don't know if that's even going to be used as a venue. It's probably ICC aren't going to fancy too many trips there. So but yeah, it's one of those where I feel like they could do okay, but I feel as though they're battered still. There's not enough good players at pace and bounce, and I think that felt like it was always going to be an issue, and I think was an issue in the end, despite the fact that they came pretty close to doing okay. I think there was still plenty to like. I mean, also just a quick word, we should mention Hasaranga having the weirdest tournament ever, where he had loads of really, really good games, and then one of the worst games anyone's ever had against Australia, when I think he went for 55 off 3 overs and got absolutely pumped. So yeah, just a quick shout out to him.
One thing I would say about Sri Lanka is, between now and the next tournament, so many of their players are in the IPL and now back at PSL level and 100 level, and all those different tournaments. We could have a couple of swift developments. People are looking at them again, which in 2018, 2019, 2020, no one was looking for talent in Sri Lanka. So we could have something there. So the beginning of our top tier, I've got South Africa at the bottom of this, partly because the whole Wayne Parnell thing at 7, that's done, Roller. I'm out on that. I was uncomfortable about that in the last World Cup. Watching them lose to the Netherlands, I became a lot more clear in my belief that was not any good. But if you look at the entire team, I still think that if you had a bowling lineup that had Nokia, Ngidi, and Maharaj maybe at 9, right? And then you just had like a bunch of all-rounders, you could actually free up Quinton de Kock to play the way that he should, Aiden Markram to attack a little bit more, David Miller would be more exciting, Rassie wouldn't have to be 30 off 30 every single game, right? Like there's certainly something within that, and Delwood Brevis, there's talent coming through. They're about to get, they're about to have for the first time ever a really, really top level local league. All those things are happening. I think there is a good 15 players that they can do, but I think that obviously the Bavuma thing, I mean, it didn't help that he wasn't in form, because if he was in form, this is probably the tournament that Bavuma should have done well. It was like, he could have got a bunch of short balls that he could have tapped around the corner and it wouldn't have looked like his strike rate was too bad. And he should have handled the moving ball better than most of the rest of the guys in that order. But even if you take that aside, it's like this whole idea of like only having 6 batters. It's just, it doesn't work. You need at least 7.
Well,
You know, that whole theory about this number 7 doesn't bat too much. It's like, yeah, but if your opener looks up and sees the number 7 is Wayne fucking Parnell, they're gonna block about an extra 5 balls that they don't need to.
I think the other big issue with that, and I don't know to what extent this came down to batting depth versus just quality as spinners, but it felt like a lot of their bowling picks, especially Maharaj versus Shamsi, was done on, who's going to offer a tiny bit with the bat in the event that they end up getting picked, or almost creating like that artificial batting depth. Of being like, oh well, you've got Rabada who can bat a bit, and Maharaj who can bat a bit, and Parnell. So maybe you're making a number 7 by having 3 number 8s. But actually, arguably, those guys are number 9s. So it was. It's a really strange team, South Africa, because I did look at the batting lineup, despite the fact they couldn't be quite as all guns blazing as they would have been, and for a lot of that tournament, and even still now, to be honest, I think they probably should have got to the semi-finals. I think they're a decent side on paper. Their win against India in particular, that was a real that was a huge result, and they were great value for it as well. So I think. I might even, to be honest, despite all the drawbacks that you say, I might nudge them a spot or two higher than you did. I think they're a pretty solid side, and I think especially when you consider the players that are coming through, Brevis looks like he's going to be a generational player. Then even Johnson. Still, you have, I was speaking to someone the other day who was telling me sort of, rave reviews about Kurtzia, whose name I've probably butchered there, the seamer. Who I think is probably going to be on a few auction shortlists at the IPL or a net bowler if not. There's clearly talent coming through, but yeah, it just didn't work. And I think the frustrating thing as well was that final day of the tournament of the Super 12s, even, which was just the perfect day for national stereotypes, wasn't it? About South Africa don't have any bottle, and Pakistan, wow, they're so unpredictable, you don't know which team's going to turn up on the day. And it was like, right, okay, yeah, I suppose we do have to buy into this again. But yeah, I don't know. I think they were an all right side. I think they had a stinking day, and were fine for half of a game against Pakistan, and then not very fine for the other half of it.
You could talk me into putting them up, because the next couple of teams I have right above them are New Zealand and Australia, and there's a shit ton of questions about both of those teams going into that next World Cup. And I think there should be fewer questions. South Africa and India are the two teams that, if they just fix the basic problems, I don't think talent and the age of that talent is the problem, right? Whereas New Zealand and Australia have proper concerns, I think, going into that next World Cup. And it'd be really interesting to talk to someone like Andrew McDonald or George Bailey or whoever about Australia's issues, and the same with in New Zealand. So how Gary Stead would be looking at that prospect. But at the same time, I just I don't know, you keep coming in with no batters, and then in clutch games, because for me, you gotta remember, I'm older than you, Roller. This is something that they've been trying to cheat the number 6, 7, 8, 9 position one way or another for years, right? And I feel like they just never get it right in tournaments. And when you have to chase anything that's a little bit prickly in a tournament, I just feel that they're always going to fuck it up. And I'm willing to say that the curse is nonsense, and eventually they'll just win, and we'll all be like, that was funny. But I'm not there at the moment. And Wayne Parnell at number 7, I'm sorry, you deserve to lose to the Netherlands if you get a bat Wayne Parnell. And all the people who are going to say, oh, he's an all-rounder, fuck off, he is. He's not an all-rounder. Wayne Parnell doesn't think he's an all-rounder. It's ridiculous. All right. I've got New Zealand next. And a lot of this is age curve, although I could have had Australia in this position as well. Next World Cup, Bolt and Southey are going to be 35. Ferguson is going to be 33. Neesham and Williamson 34. I think Conway might be 33 as well. You've got the Kyle Jamieson question of whether he will ever become a T20 bowler or not. He probably should, but whether he does. And then you've got, I think Finn Allen I think his numbers probably flatter him a little bit, but I do think he is very, very good. And I think Glenn Phillips showed us that he is at that level. But I'm not sure, if the entire squad, if it has all aged out a little bit. And in some ways, the bowling attack's not that old, because Santner and Sodhi, I think, are both around, 28, 29. They're not as old as they look, despite the fact that Sodhi got a job that made him sound 40 when he was working for Rajasthan one year. But they're not actually that old. But I think there is a bit of a generational push that might affect them coming to that next World Cup. Now, I think Milne will be 32. Maybe there's enough people out there, but from that perspective, I just have some very big concerns on what exactly their team is going to be like at that next World Cup, especially if Bolt and Southey sign deals with franchises and disappear, and maybe a couple of other players do as well. They're in real danger of that sort of thing happening also.
Yeah, I suppose New Zealand over the last 15 years have probably played the explosion of T20 cricket and leagues and IPL better than any other board, and now this is probably the huge test as to whether that was actually sustainable. There are two ways it pans out, which are either they managed to keep getting these guys to play some bilateral series, but then because they're playing loads of T20 around the world, they then plug in at tournaments and just upgrade the side, and the player pool's already looking bigger because they've sort of managed to get the 20th best player in New Zealand to get some game time during all the bilateral series, and everything works out quite well, which sort of seems to be what you'd probably expect from New Zealand because of the fact that they have consistently managed their cricket management and governance and all that sort of stuff has been so good for a period of time. The other way is, of course, players don't end up playing at that World Cup, and management say, well, you need to be available for more cricket. We can't just have you coming in at short notice, or something doesn't click or whatever. I don't know which way it's going to go. I thought they were a slightly weird team at this World Cup, as they quite often are. I think if you look at their attack, I kind of, because of the fact Neesham bowled quite a lot in the last World Cup, I kept on expecting Neesham to come on and be the sixth bowler, whereas actually they only used 5 bowlers through the whole thing, and they always used 8 overs of spin, which was like, okay, you've probably got this one a bit the wrong way around, because quite often they would end up bowling, I think they probably bowled more spin. I don't have the numbers, but I would expect they probably bowled as much spin, at least in this tournament, as they did in the UAE. Which isn't really what you'd expect. And then they had the really weird thing as well, in a similar-ish way to South Africa, I guess, in that Santner is probably a better batter than Parnell, but was still coming in at 7, and they clearly didn't trust him, so you end up getting scores like 150 for 4 in a game against Pakistan, which is just a sort of weird old-school score. And I think, much as I really like Finn Allen, it was almost like a sort of internal contradiction to have an explosive opener whose whole career has tried to score at 2 runs a ball and constantly hit boundaries, and bring him in for someone like Guptill, who's a bit more anchory and a bit more old school. But then to have that explosive player, but then when it didn't come off, leave yourself quite as vulnerable as they did, because then Williamson would come in and get 14 or 14 in the power play like he always does. And it just didn't quite make sense to me. I guess you could argue their player pool probably isn't there. If you look at the players they were leaving out, there weren't that many who were thinking, God, this guy has to play. I can't believe they're not picked him. I think they were probably just trying to do the old Kiwi thing of making the best of what we've got, and all that stuff about punching above their weight, which, to be fair, reaching the semis with this team was probably they were probably a 50-50 chance at the start of the World Cup, and are probably pretty happy they made it. Was slightly surprised that Lockie was as expensive as he was across the tournament. I think there was a point where I thought he'd probably graduated to that next level of being being like an elite T20 fast bowler, whereas I think maybe he hasn't quite yet. But yeah, interested to see how he goes in the IPL. And I think they were all right, but yeah, Kiwi.
So just the Santner versus Parnell thing. So I think also you're right from that perspective, that they're especially in this tournament, when they did have Neesham and Phillips, who were going to be up the order, who could have actually just dropped Sodhi at one stage, or or played something with it. One thing I would say between the two differences: Wayne Parnell's T20 international strike rate is below a run a ball. Santner actually strikes around 130, and that's across domestic as well. And I know that Parnell's had a bit of encouragement, but I still think if you're looking up, I just don't think it's that same level. I think Santner gives them something extra. But if Santner's at 8, right, then and you use Neesham and Phillips to do the Glenn Maxwell, Marcus Stoinis role, right? I think that might have been something quite interesting for them. I don't think that's why they lost specifically, though. I think they like having the extra bowler in that side. I think you might be right that Milne is probably the extra bowler that should have been in that side. And Sodhi maybe, could have been left out. But Ferguson especially because Bolt and Southey were so good at times, I thought that Ferguson was at that level where you just can't hit him. You know, he was just in that period where you can't hit him, and he wasn't like that this World Cup. Australia, so Stark might be gone forever, despite the fact that it would be ridiculous, but hey, it might be gone. Cummins doesn't look like he's ever going to have the time to become a really good T20 bowler. I'd love to be proven wrong. Cameron Green still hasn't played any T20 cricket and yet was seen as the answer, which I think tells you everything that you need to know. David Warner is going to be, about 43 when the next tournament comes around. I don't know how good the Joshes are. I think at the next tournament, we're going to be having the same conversation about whether Australia should be playing Kane Richardson, and also the same conversation about whether Agar or Zampa should be in the team. And that is my concern because, you know, I don't watch as much Big Bash as I used to, but I went through the Big Bash numbers recently and it's like Ashton Turner's still one of the best players. And I think Ashton Turner's an incredible talent, but he's probably not at the level that he's going to swing a World Cup level talent, right? And there just isn't, you know, the fact that Ben McDermott had a very good chance of getting in this team and in this squad. Ben McDermott's just you know, he's a mid-tier franchise level T20 player, I think, at best. And so what's coming through? It's literally, you hope Cameron Green gets really good, or I'm not sure that there's a bunch of, you know, Alice is the only player. Alice and Green are the only two players. I'm like, well, they could be really good at that next World Cup. But other than that, I'm like, I don't know. But it's still, you know, Hazelwood, Warner, you know, Tim David's going to be in there. The two Joshes can play if one of them doesn't get injured playing golf or whatever he did. You know, there is some talent out there. But if you said to me that South Africa should be in front of New Zealand and Australia, I'd be like, yeah, that's more than fair. Because I have so many questions with New Zealand and Australia. With South Africa, I'm like, I think you could fix this team fairly easy. Whether you will or not, I have no idea.
I think you wrote something about this during the tournament. I thought it was really funny how Australia effectively had exactly the same group stage twice, admittedly with a washout this time. But in 2021, they won the tournament having got absolutely hammered by England and won all their other Super 12 games. And this year, they got absolutely hammered by New Zealand and won all their other Super 12 games. But because of, you know, I don't know whether it was sort of media narrative or body language experts or what exactly it was, but there was some kind of general vibe around that everyone was like, no, Australia is now terrible. Having previously been, oh my God, Australia. I don't think anyone was actually saying it, but sort of solved T20 cricket in 2021. It's just interesting to see the contrast, I guess. I think across the two tournaments, Australia are probably the second or third or fourth or something like that best team. If you take those two tournaments as, you know, two different World Cups in quite different conditions across 12 months, I think they were up there, but not the best team. And I think all these structural issues that you talk about, you know, the Big Bash, where it is, why isn't it producing these players? How do you get to a position where the big three quicks haven't played very much T20 cricket between them, but are coming into a tournament as the main three guys? How do you balance the side? Because that's been a sort of constant battle over the last however long, because they went through that huge period of having Agar at 7 and then completely dropped that midway through, well, on the eve of the tournament last time, and then played one game in the middle where they changed it back and got hammered. And I think all of this stuff that has been the sort of question marks around Australian T20 cricket in the last however long, it's was there last year, it's still there now. And I don't think a lot has actually changed in that period. I think they probably made one change in personnel, which was a good change. Smith out, David in, and maybe they could have risked it and gone a couple of others. Maybe they could have had Ellis in for Stark or Cummins, but I don't know. I don't think it made a huge difference.
Ellis in for Stark. Yeah, I think Ellis in for the Stark. You saw what happened when they dropped Stark when he was bowling shit, right? If they had gone through that World Cup and still won 3 games and lost 1 game, and Stark hadn't played, you know what the narrative would have been. It would have gone like Bailey would have almost Bailey and McDonald, whoever made the ultimate decision, would have lost their jobs, right? And it wouldn't have made any more sense than anything else. They were overrated last time, and they're probably being underrated this time. But they're a team with, as I said, all those issues I've just said. I'm not sure any of that is going to go away in that next tournament unless some incredible wave of talent, unless some young Australian cricketer starts playing for Spain and makes a bunch of runs and, does a Tim David. By the way, Spanish cricket is looking for young Australian cricketers. So if you are an Australian cricketer who's pretty handy and wants to play for Spain, get in touch with me and I'll pass you through to them. Now we come on to India. Again, I think I had India slightly higher because the Jadeja Bumrah, not being available, right? And also, a bit like South Africa, it's just like, I think there's just a few tweaks that you can, and maybe those tweaks are not small, like dropping Virat Kohli and Rohit Sharma are not small tweaks. But on a pure talent basis, and also the way that they were playing T20 cricket before this World Cup, I felt that, Australia, England, West Indies, and maybe India were the 4 teams that came to this World Cup going, we're just going to smash 4s and 6s everywhere. And then literally they turned on the TV and watched Sri Lanka versus Namibia and were like, oh, shit. And I thought India, probably early on, were the best team at going, no, we can't play that way, right? And then they finally got to a game where they should have played that way and gone back to that style, and it was gone. I still believe, I think that India could have a very similar lineup to England and bat very, very deep, and have a lot of bowling options, and say to Jadeja and say to Ashwin, there are going to be games where you guys just don't bowl your overs, right? But Ash, if you can bat at number 10 or number 9, that's huge for us, and then we can just tell the guys up the order to smack the shit out of it. But I'm at this stage, I just don't know. I don't know if India was bad enough for the BCCI to actually do what happened in 2015 with England, right? Which is go, let's just back the young talent and go all in. Because actually, when you look at the 2 tournaments, they weren't that bad. And Indian fans don't want to hear that. Indian fans want to hear they were terrible. But when you actually go through it, you're like, they weren't that bad. I mean, they could have beat South Africa in that game, right? But twice South Africa tried to smash them out of their game and they forced their way back in. And coming back from the dead against Pakistan as well, they had a bit of a across the 2 tournaments, I don't think they were as bad as it probably feels like if you're an Indian fan right now. But because they've been losing since 2014, I can understand why an Indian fan is like, I don't care, Jarrod, shut up.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I almost, to be honest, in the semi, I didn't think it was that much of an intent issue early on. I think the new ball was easier to face in the run chase when the lights had come in, and I think Rohit just looked like he was massively out of form for most of the comp. Like he was trying to score runs in Adelaide.
13 over period mark though.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, 13 period mark. I was like, what are you doing?
Yeah, I'm not trying to build up like a 20 ball 20 or whatever it was as an amazing innings on a pitch where England got 170 and 16 overs. But I thought it was more of a he looks horribly out of touch thing rather than a this guy doesn't know how to play T20 cricket or anything like that. I think having sort of looked at India's squad at the end of last World Cup, I thought, well, there's obviously going to be a lot of, they should completely change everything. They should change the personnel because they were, they lost 2 games and were basically out of that last World Cup. So I sort of saw why there was going to be that big reaction, and then looked at it and was like, well, actually, in Australia, you probably want a top 3 of Rohit, KL Rahul and Virat. And, Virat did really well and the openers didn't really. Maybe they took it too far, but what's that?
Yeah, you and I watch a lot of IPL. There's not like 4 guys out of this squad that would have made them a much better team in this particular tournament.
Not at all.
There's a couple of fringe players, obviously, and Jadeja and Bumrah not being around. Umran Malik would have been really handy, but I'm not sure that they play him anywhere outside of perhaps Perth. And I don't think their seam bowlers were... He bowls in the middle overs. Their main problem was really probably more at the death anyway. Like Shaheen Afridi going off against them. You probably shouldn't have that happening. And so I'm looking at it and I'm like, yeah, maybe Chahal should have played a couple of times. Probably should have played at Adelaide looking back. But I don't think going in, I was like, Chahal has to play because it's Adelaide. Like, I could have seen them picking him. I don't think they made that many mistakes. Their actual style of cricket also was fitting, as you said. They were coming to Australia. Then they got the early season wickets like everyone else did. They had that top 3. It just didn't work. And that's the hardest thing to explain to fans, which is it just didn't click in the way that it was supposed to, and they didn't win the games that they should have. But they get 1 extra wicket. Was it a drop catch? Was it Virat that dropped the catch out at deep mid wicket in the South Africa chase?
I think so, yeah.
Off Ashwin.
But yeah.
they take that catch, and then Wayne Parnell is like padding up, and you're thinking, we've got a real big chance here.
Yeah.
Sorry to go back to Wayne Parnell.
Poor Wayne, he's gonna have an absolute nightmare listening to this.
Bloody good bowler though. Hasn't he improved his bowling?
He's got a good Instagram feed as well. I thought heading into the semis, I went on a pod and sort of said one of those things where something blurts out and you think, oh God, did I mean that? Where I said I thought India had the worst attack of the 4 semi-finalists. And I feel like that did come to pass, because much as, Arshdeep bowled pretty well in the tournament, Shami and Bhuvi both did all right at times, I felt like there was never quite enough wicket-taking threat, and I couldn't quite work out whether they were going for, we're going to take wickets with the new ball and that's how we're going to control the innings, or whether we're going to squeeze in the middle with the finger spinners without taking wickets, but we're just going to make scoring pressure such a big thing. And then they didn't quite have enough at the death either. So it almost was like a balanced attack, but wasn't quite strong enough in any given phase that they were ever going to control a game, or it didn't feel like they had a plan to control an innings. I did think, it's one of those tricky situations that you get into in a World Cup where you back a finisher for a while and he doesn't score runs in 2 or 3 games, and suddenly your tournament's on the line and you make a change. But I do think it was weird that, they backed Kartik to be the guy for however many months, like 6 months heading into this tournament, and then get rid of him right at the end for, I love Pant, but he was out of form. I get why they did it with the whole left-hand, right-hand thing, and then used him at 6 as well, which was weird.
And then, but also DK got run out in one of those innings.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? And perhaps was it even run out? And then there was the scramble stumping, at the end.
And it's
you know what I mean?
Just like, random shit happens in World Cups sometimes, especially for a middle order batter. And the other thing that I thought was frustrating on that point is they back Chahal for most of that period as well as the leg spinner, and then didn't pick him in the World Cup for a single game. I don't think Chahal's played a single game at either of the last T20 World Cups, which feels wrong somehow. So I don't really know how that's happened, given he's played pretty much 2/3 of bilateral games for India during the period between them. Something's not quite worked there, where they don't trust him enough to play him in a World Cup, but do want to play him in every other game.
Yeah, I think they have one bit of bad luck, which was I think Harshal Patel would have been very good in a summer Australian World Cup, right? And I think he would have bowled a little bit like Dwayne Bravo, and he would have been very effective in a summer World Cup. But once they got there, they actually needed another proper seamer, and they didn't really have that in that. He's not the person you could bring in. So suddenly they had this guy that probably wasn't going to help them that much in that particular environment as well. Like had they had, I don't know, Rashid Krishna or who's the guy from Kolkata?
Shivam Mavi.
Shivam Mavi, or who's the other guy that bowled quite well last year? He was bowling for them against South Africa in the one days. If they'd had someone like that, who on paper, like you wouldn't say, oh, this is the guy we need in the team, right? But when you get to Australia, like Arshdeep suddenly looked like a way better player than I thought he was going to be at Australia because of the way that World Cup broke. But not having that other bowler. Having said that, you look at someone like New Zealand, and they didn't even go with that extra bowler. So some teams did. Who did? South Africa went with the extra seam bowler, and Pakistan went with the extra seam bowler. So not every team went all in on that. But I did think that Harshal absolutely wasn't ideal for that situation. All right, Pakistan. Hilarious, of course, and brilliant, and the ability to almost lose from those positions should be celebrated on its own. I still think when you look at the 2 World Cups, they're up there. I don't know if they're quite in the same tier of England. In fact, the more I'm talking about all these other teams, I almost want England in a separate tier right at the moment, especially considering all their injuries. But I don't think Pakistan's quite in that tier, but they certainly should. Like you and I could argue over South Africa, New Zealand, Australia, and India. I don't think we can argue about Pakistan over the last 2 World Cups not being the best team. Also, they're incredibly young, and someone like Shadab should continue to develop. They clearly need 1 or 2 better middle order options or lower middle order options available to them going forward. But I think it would have been a disastrous 2 World Cups if they hadn't have even made a final, considering the talent they have. And we can talk about the Rizwan Ababa opening stand as much as we want. I think that has to be split up before the next World Cup. I think one of them has to bat at 3 or 4. But their game plan still got them to a situation where if Ben Stokes had holed out off Iftikhar, they might still have actually stolen that game, right? So they're not that far away. Even if it's the most one-dimensional game plan in T20 cricket, it's a hell of a dimension.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think despite the fact they were, whatever the situation was, England needed 41 off 30 balls when Shaheen came back, and it's very difficult to not think what if. I think last year was almost more of a missed opportunity for them just because of the disproportionate amount of cricket they played in the UAE compared to everyone else. They seemed so well suited to those conditions in a way that they, coming to Australia, I thought, well, not many of these guys have played in the Big Bash. Pakistan haven't played a lot of bilateral cricket in Australia recently. I can see this being quite tough. And yeah, I thought they did pretty well, all told. I think to have reached the final in conditions that clearly weren't going to be ideal for them is a pretty good achievement, and to have taken it as close as they did, they needed one more bit of luck really for Shaheen's knee to hold up through the tournament, and then it's arguably a 50-50 game if Shaheen has those 2 overs at the end. I thought they made a really good change early on when they brought Wasim Jr. in. I thought it just made their side look so much more balanced, where you had 4 quicks and 2 spinners. Shadab was brilliant. The fact that they relied so much on those 2 openers for so much of the last 2 years, and then neither of them had good tournaments, and they still managed to reach the final. That was a pretty good effort. And yeah, much as there's been some sort of contentious selections in the middle order, and that seems like it's going to be a never-ending issue for Pakistan cricket. Masood did kind of do a job at times. Like I think he ended up as their equal highest run scorer with Rizwan. Played some pretty important innings. I mean, particularly in the final, if he stayed in for another 10 balls, they might have got just enough. For all the obvious flaws that Iftikhar has, for example, he did play a really, really good innings against India that nearly won them the game.
2 innings, didn't he? Did he make another 50 as well?
Yeah, he did actually. Yeah, you're right, against South Africa. Yeah. So, and then
he made almost all of his career runs now in Australia in T20 cricket. It's phenomenal. So yeah, there's something there. They're young. Shadab can bat top 6, right?
Yeah.
I think if you've got a bowler who is a genuine top frontline bowler who can bat top 6, and he should improve. I think he's been found out a little bit in the last couple of years now that people are probably scouting for him a little bit more than they were beforehand. But he could certainly bat in their top 6. And so that should give them incredible flexibility. It'd be interesting to see what, Wasim Jr. does when he's not playing on pitches that bounce, because he looked as likely to hit the ball as you or I do in those particular games. But yeah, I think they're really interesting going ahead. And, that next World Cup could certainly help them. Let's get on to England. So I've now, while we've been discussing this, mentally moved them into a tier on their own, because they probably should have won the last World Cup. They have won this World Cup. And yet, what are we up to? 11 combined injuries across those 2 tournaments. We still haven't seen, we may never see Jofra again. Like, they may never be at full form. We don't know. But if you put Jofra into either of these sides, it's just ridiculous, right? Like, if Jofra comes back at 90% of what he used to be, it would be an absolutely incredible side. And, I've just finished doing, another project on them. And it's like, I don't think we've ever seen them at a World Cup fully firing. I think in 2019, they were kind of all over the shop. 2017, they looked really good and then, shat the bed in the semi-final. 2016, they were trying to work it out, but it was quite one-dimensional what they were doing back then. 2021, obviously, was the injuries. This one was injuries and getting caught out on the wrong kind of surfaces against Ireland and not playing particularly smart. What happens if they actually play the way that you and I think they can play? Like, I don't see how any other teams can touch. They just made Sam Curran, he shouldn't have been player of the tournament, obviously, absolutely horrendously stupid idea, but they just made Sam Curran a makeshift death bowler, and he won player of the tournament. Like, it's bizarre how much success they have with like these role players.
Yeah. I think, well, you nailed it there in terms of the injuries. I was yesterday trying to sort of work out like what would be, could I find like an 11 of England players that weren't available for the final, and I was picking it, and I was like, well, so your attack is going to be Wood, Topley, Archer, Willie, and then I was like, hold on, so didn't appear in the final at least. I was like, Wood, Topley, Archer, Willie, and then I was like, hold on, I'm leaving Saqib Mahmood and Tamal Mills out of my sort of second string England team here, out of players that didn't play, and they didn't have Bairstow, they didn't have Roy, and they have Milan. You can make a case that Root would have been an all right player if things had transpired very differently over the last 3 years. He probably would be an all right middle order accumulator in the similar sort of role Stokes did. And while it's quite interesting, we always sort of want to talk about T20 cricket in these big tactical philosophies and all this sort of stuff. And England clearly have gone all in on batting. They had Chris Jordan was carded at number 10. It's very difficult to sort of make the case that they didn't have incredible batting depth in the knockout stages. But if you look at the fact that they basically had 4 must-win games at the end of the tournament. In the first game, they had a big opening partnership and then some slightly chaotic hitting against New Zealand to get up to 180, which was a good score, but no one in the middle order got more than 20, I think. Then against Sri Lanka, they had a real grind run chase where Stokes anchored and scored at 110, and that was the big thing after a big opening stand. Then they had another massive opening stand against India, which won them the game. And then in the final, again, it was a massive grind from Stokes. So actually, 2 of those 4 games, I mean, Chris Jordan was talking about it. He was interviewed by Sky yesterday after the final and was talking about how Butler's sort of big message since they arrived in Australia, and they sort of realised that it was going to be slightly different to, playing bilateral cricket in England or playing in Pakistan where they'd just been. He was like, we need to be adaptable. We need to be able to win ugly, basically, and to sort of dig deep and do all that sort of thing. And 2 of those 4 wins were really ugly wins. They were set up by bowlers and then pretty ugly run chases where they crept over the line in not that convincing style, but you always thought they were probably marginal favourites. So I think the fact that, England have been built up as a team with this great strategy and philosophy, and they probably do have that overarching, and there is still the whole fearless, ultra-attacking, ultra-positive stuff that people talk about having filtered down into English domestic cricket, which it definitely has. The elite level, the team, the flagship team, is one that has actually become quite adaptable and just really, really good as well, rather than just doubling down on this philosophy. They win a lot of games. I think since they arrived in Australia, if you look at games that lasted 40 overs or could have lasted 40 overs, they've won every game. They beat Australia 2-0. They lost to Ireland in a rain-reduced game that was probably a coin toss. They clearly played really badly at the MCG against Ireland, but that was probably a coin toss game. I think CricViz had them slightly ahead at the point when they went off, and other than that, they've just kept on winning games one way or another. So yeah, I agree. I do think across the 2 tournaments, they are the best team. But and especially because they've changed quite a lot since the last tournament. They've changed a lot since 2019. They've changed quite a lot since the last tournament in terms of personnel, and yet people keep coming into the side and keep managing to do well. So that sort of seems to speak to there being quite a lot of it just being a team where people plug in, understand roles, and plan well, and therefore play well.
2015, Mitchell Starc is the player of the World Cup for Australia. 2019, I would argue he was better. Right. And by this tournament, he's absolutely a spent force. They've tried to give him this wobble ball for Test cricket. It's completely ruined his new ball bowling for Australia. Right. Sam Curran, who's a fucking power play bowler who doesn't always get through his 4 overs at the top level, suddenly becomes a better death bowler than Mitchell Starc. You have to question how well England are handling what. Sam Curran's he's obviously a clearly above average level talent, but how well they are handling their players compared to everyone else. I think there's just no other way of looking at that and going, things are working well. Where there was all this stuff about fast bowlers, and India had all these medium pace bowlers and whatever, and it's like, well, Sam Curran was player of the tournament, right? Like it's the whole thing is completely remarkable, and I think yeah, they were definitely the best team. Matt Roller, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.